as I explained in the last lesson, the sense data theory, which we really covered quite quickly, links quite well. It quite nicely links to the idea of indirect realism, which is a kind of an opposite, a contradiction, an opposite view to direct realism. So in this lesson, we're going to really look at the story so far, recap everything we've learned so far, just so we're keeping track of everything that's going on. And then we're going to introduce and explain the idea of indirect realism. And then we're going to finally just touch on John Locke's view of indirect realism and really where it came from. So what's the story so far? So we've discussed a number of things thus far. We've explained the basic idea of the direct realist notion of openness of the world through perception. I perceive something with my mind. I have a direct link between that and the object. We then showed why that position might be unconvincing by looking at the hallucination argument and the illusion argument. If I have a hallucination, I can't actually delineate between a real perception and a hallucination. And if I've got an hallucination, then I can't actually have a direct link between objects. So how does that work? Then we looked at our first move towards the indirect realist theory, which is the idea of the sense data theory of perception. And in this lesson, we're going to look at, in a lot more detail, indirect realism as a whole and where the sense data theory fits into indirect realism. So, when we looked at sense data theory, one of the things that is interesting is that there was the possibility that we could explain perception without any commitment to the external world. I mentioned that in the last video. We could claim that there wasn't even an external world at all. We could claim that the external world doesn't even exist. And sense data theory would still work out. And so would indirect realism. However, we didn't mention that there are multiple kinds of sense data theories. There is the indirect realist sense data theory, which suggests that there are definitely mind-independent physical objects. There are things like my water bottle, they do actually exist in reality, beyond the idea of sense data. The only thing that's different is that we just don't have any kind of direct interaction with it. Okay, we have an indirect interaction with it. There are also idealist and phenomenalist theories of sense data, which suggest that there aren't actually any mind-independent objects. All that exists in reality are the minds. My mind or your mind, okay? This water bottle doesn't exist, this microphone doesn't exist, this laptop that I'm using to record this lesson on doesn't exist. There is just sense data theory. So they might have slight differences, but we can both agree with the notion, that perception is just a relation between our minds and this mind-dependent sense data. That's what's different. There's no mind-independent link. So the indirect realist does believe that there are actual mind-independent objects. This laptop does actually exist. This water bottle does actually exist in reality. That's what the indirect realist suggests. What the indirect realist says is that we just perceive them indirectly. We don't have a direct causal link between the two. We have a direct link to the sense data, and the sense data resembles the mind-independent objects, the real world. That's what they say. So as an analogy, we could say that like a direct realist is arguing for a view like watching a TV. Okay, so this might sound a bit weird, but let me just get on to it. When we watch the TV, we're perceiving images on a screen. Okay, in this analogy, the sense data is like the images on the TV. We perceive the images on the TV, the sense data, but we don't actually perceive the objects on TV. If I'm watching a film, I'm not actually seeing there's not a direct link between my eyes and the person acting in this film. Because in between them, there's a camera and then there's a TV, and I'm seeing it through the TV. So it's almost like watching. So the sense data indirect realist suggests that it's almost like watching a TV. Okay, we have a direct link between us and the TV, and the TV has a direct link between the real world and it. So in the indirect realist view, we have a direct link between our mind and the mind-dependent sense data theory the sense data, okay, and the sense data has a link between itself and whatever is in the real world, the mind independent objects, the water bowl, for example. This ties into the Lockean view of indirect realism. Okay, this is a specific example of a philosophical position, and it comes from the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke, and he fundamentally argues that a subject S perceives O, an object, if and only if S has some idea I of O, if that makes sense. Okay, that sounds very confusing when you're reading it out loud. So a subject perceives an object if and only if the subject has some idea of that object. Here Locke uses the word idea, but this could just as easily mean sense data. So it could be a subject S perceives an object O if and only if S has some sense data of O. It could easily be the same thing. You're effectively talking about the same thing. So that's what we're looking at here. According to the Lockean view, S is the person doing the perceiving, you and I. O is the perceived object, the real mind independent object, and I is some kind of image, a mental representation, and that's effectively it. Okay, so we have a direct connection to the image of our perception, but not to the object itself, and that gets around the hallucination and the illusion argument. I may or may not be linked to O in any way at all. Okay, that's what we look at when we look at idealist sense data theory. But for this, we're just looking at indirect realist sense data theory. All we know is that there is a direct representation, I, an image or a sense data, and that is the representation of O. Okay, and we have a link to I. So rather than it being A links to O, it's A links to I, or S links to I. That's what we have, and that is effectively an alternative view to direct realism, to the intuitive understanding of perception. In summary, there are different kinds of sense data theory. There's the real quite strong sense data theory, the sort of Berkeleyan view, okay? And in this lesson we looked at the indirect realist view of sense data, okay? And we looked at the Lockean explanation for indirect realist view. We can't really finish up before we talk about the problems with indirect realism, and that's what we're going to do in the final lesson, and really conclude this entire introduction. As an introduction, we took a look at direct realism, problems with that, indirect realism, problems with that. So we're going to finish by looking at the problems with indirect realism.